Good evening, saints. Before you is Nontuthuko. Yeah, unmuted. Before you is Dr. Nontuthuko Khumalo. Now Chayinga, I greet you all in the wonderful and mighty name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It is an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here before you. As I was preparing for this discussion, and it's obviously quite a weighty one that can end up being quite discouraging. As I drove late this afternoon, and I believe it was God Himself, the song Nontuthuko He started playing. And I think it was just such a grounding reminder that, God is the ultimate joy giver. And I think that's the stance that we need to take into tonight's discussion as we talk about mental health and mental health disorders in particular. Just holding on to the assurance that He is ultimately the joy giver, and I do believe He has gone before us this evening. I want to, before I start, just greet the mother of this phenomenal ministry, Pastor Tsefo. Thank you so much for the invitation, and we honor you. I honor you, woman of God. Thank you for the invitation, and I just pray that in partaking of this, I pray, my prayer is that the ministry may grow onwards and upwards. I am going to be sharing a few slides, and I think the discussion, Bazalwane, this evening is just going to be around mental health and mental health disorders. So if you can just bear with me, I'm just quickly going to load. Let's just quickly try and load the presentation. Okay, let's not share it. Okay, just 30 seconds as I load the presentation. Okay, let's start that again. There we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, fantastic. So saints, just my apologies. I also want to greet all members of the fivefold who may be on the call, and just greet you all. I think obviously the guests of honor being all of you outside of rank. I do always believe that God reveals to empower and to equip us. And so anything that He teaches us or any new information that we come across is always for us to be equipped and empowered and to take forward. He says in the book of Psalms, I think it's the book of Psalms 18 that speaks about God training our hands for battle. And so that's what I always think when I come across new information or new knowledge. And so I do encourage you, please do take notes. This discussion, more than anything, is just to raise awareness around the current crisis and scourge of mental health and mental illness. in the world. And just a quick outline then of what we'll be looking at tonight. I've titled the talk Mind Over Matter. And so we'll just go through a few definitions. We'll talk then about the scourge of mental health broadly, just the definitions around, mental health and mental illness. And then just zooming in then to, I think, two of the biggest crises in and around mental health, and those being depression and anxiety. And then just a quick word on personality disorders. And I think just before we reach the closing, perhaps I can just invite everybody or anybody who may have questions or even a comment to raise it then. And please do feel free, I think, as we go along, to pose or post any questions or comments or thoughts on the chat. Right, so as we open, just for some context, I want to look at the scripture of Mark 12:28-31. And so this is a scribe who's asking Jesus basically, what is the most important thing? So it says there, then one of the scribes came, and having heard them reasoning together, perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, which is the first commandment of all? Other versions would say, which is the most important commandment of all? Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second, like it, is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And so I think what strikes me about this excerpt is how the entity of the mind is already separated. It could have easily, the scripture could have easily said, love the Lord with all your strength or with all your heart, but the entity of the mind is separated here, which tells you that it's an entity that has its own functions. And I think also speaks then to the power of the mind as a separate entity. And perhaps in then understanding mental health, one of the first things you have to understand is what it is that the mind, or in this instance, let's say what the brain does. So very important to understand. The brain enables, amongst other things, your thoughts and your decisions, your memories and your emotions. It enables your movement, something that we call your motor function. So that's your movements, that's your coordination, that's your balance. It also enables your perception. It also enables other things like your stress responses, what we call your autonomic regulations. It regulates also your speech and language and other sort of automatic responsible behaviors like your breathing, temperature, sleep, etc. Why am I highlighting this? I think once you come to understand how expansive the functions of the brain are, it then would help you to understand the symptoms that someone that has a mental illness or mental health disorder presents with, because all or some of those components already would be affected. So emotions, speech and language, the executive functioning, i.e. the ability to make decisions. And so against that background, let's define what is mental health. And so the World Health Organization is the top body in health, defines mental health as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with life stresses, realize their abilities, learn and work well as contributed to their community. And I think already that definition, what's already coming across is how mental health is not just a me issue, it's a community issue, because it may affect one person, however, its impact is outside of the person. It's not only the person, it's the family, it's the community at large. And so mental health is an integral component of health in its entirety and well-being. And it also underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. And so I think that also speaks to the agency that one often loses when they have a mental health disorder. So I thought to go into the numbers. They're quite startling at this point, but maybe we'll go into the numbers, I think, when we go into the individual mental health conditions, but they are quite startling at this point. So once we've understood what mental health is, then what is a mental health disorder or a mental health condition? And I must just place a disclaimer that because this is an area that's so stigmatized, there's very great sensitivity around the terminology that is used to define. So we're moving actually away from calling it mental illness because of the stigma associated with it. But now we call it mental health disorder or a mental health condition. So having the understanding of what mental health is and what it embodies, what then is a mental health disorder? And so a mental health disorder is characterized by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior. So clinically significant means it's become so apparent that it's causing impairment. So a mental health disorder is associated with distress or impairment in important areas of functioning, which is very important, but we'll unpack that as we go. And so I think a very important thing that will probably come across very clearly tonight is also how expansive mental health disorders are. There's more than 300 known mental health conditions with 20 subcategories across mental health as a whole. So it's a very expansive, and therefore being expansive it's a very complex space. So let's start then by looking then at what are the determinants of mental health. And I've put in this slide, which I thought was very good because it already embodies, one, the risk as well as the causation. So you'll find with a lot of mental health conditions, there is a common thread or a common theme that sort of is linked to all the mental health disorders, whether it's the psychotic disorders or your depressive disorders. And you'll find that often the risk inevitably becomes the cause. And so I've included this slide because I think the breakdown is very good. So firstly, let's start on biological factors. So what predisposes people to mental health conditions? And so often you'll find that there's variation across age group, there's variations across gender, and a very strong sort of cause that is cited by, I think, a lot of clinicians or medical staff is genetics, one, and then imbalances in the chemicals of the brain. And the imbalances in the chemicals of the brain usually speak to two main chemicals, namely your dopamine and serotonin. And so that becomes very important because often you'll see that the therapies, the medication that's given, often tries to target these chemicals that are now out of sync. Then you also have, hereditary factors. So that's your familial history where you look at the lineage and you see, okay, the mom had this, therefore the daughter has this, or the son has this. Then there's also risk associated with specific medical conditions, which are many. And often you'll find that these are conditions that, one, affect the brain or affect chemicals in the body. So epilepsy is one. And often your neoplasms or malignancies, sort of your cancers basically, and then your endocrine diseases, which are usually diseases that involve, chemical imbalances, whether it's in the thyroid or any other hormone-producing organ in the body, as well as all your chronic diseases. And I think I'll come to that perhaps when I speak about your the psychosocial determinants. But basically the issue with the chronic diseases is there's often, and you'll see it a lot with depression mostly, where the weight of the change of being diagnosed with a lifelong disease often is, it poses so much change, or poses the threat of change, so much so that some people then become diagnosed with depression specifically. In terms of psychosocial determinants of health, so this speaks to just, broadly your psychosocial issues. So obviously any sort of stresses would fall into that. So anything that's a stressor, whether at home, whether at work, and of course just broader socioeconomics, poverty, economic insecurity. And this also speaks obviously to environments. So we'll find that your very sort of violent environments, children who grow up in unstable homes, or whether it's single-headed homes. So that's actually the broader sort of psychosocial, and you'll see that list is not exhaustive because there's so many psychosocial issues. Sorry, if you could mute, I think someone is unmuted. And then lastly, just your other. So that's sort of your, you can't put it in any of the other groups. So that's your miscellaneous group. So you'll find that there's toxic substances, peri and postnatal period, so pregnancy as well. Pregnancy is very difficult to put as one of the clear causes, but there's very strong links you'll see with pregnancy and depression, and then other, causes like radiation and accidents. So I've just put that as a background, and I will keep referencing this, but I think the point of this slide is just to show how broad the risks and causes of mental health are. They cut across almost every experience and everything, especially that psychosocial list. Looking at that psychosocial list, I think it almost shows you that basically any and everybody could be a victim or a sufferer of a mental health condition. So let us look at the depressed mind. And again, I'm using the broad term of the depressed mind because it comes in so many facets. Depression can be an episode, depression can be a disorder, depression can be a complication of another health illness. So we're going to call it the depressed mind. So depression in and of itself, and we're looking now at the entity of major depression, is different from your usual fluctuations. And I think that's something very important to point out. is that often we may incorrectly appropriate diagnoses to feelings. So someone who's sad for 2 days, or someone who's grieving, or someone who's been upset about something, does not necessarily have a mental health condition associated with them. And I think that's something that's become very important. I think in a world where we're so exposed to knowledge and it's so easy to come across information, we are finding almost instances of overdiagnoses. And so you'll find that when it comes to the body of mental health disorders, they are very, very specific about what they diagnose as depression, what they diagnose as anxiety, what they diagnose as a personality disorder. And so during a major depressive episode, the person will experience a depressed mood, i.e. feeling irritable, feelings of emptiness, or a loss of pleasure or interest in activities for most of the day, nearly every day for at least 2 weeks. Over and above this, there are often other symptoms present. And again, if you go back to earlier on, when we looked at the functions of the mind, you will then understand why there's these other symptoms that impair a person's existence. So often they'll have poor concentration. You might find that they're hopeless about the future. There's changes in their appetite. There's changes in their sleeping patterns. You find that they're anhedonic, so they basically have very low desire, very low motivation. They've just got very poor drive. It's a lack of drive. It's a lack of energy. And often there'll be difficulty concentrating. There'll be difficulty remembering. And a very important one, and this is something we often see in professionals, that are functioning, that look like they're functioning. But when you actually go deeper into things, you're finding that actually there may be underlying depression, and often it manifests with their inability to make decisions. And this may actually play itself out in the home as well. The other very common symptom is one that we see quite often, is that, someone who's depressed may present with, these persistent physical symptoms that don't respond to treatment. So you'll see them this week, you see them in 2 weeks, you see them the next week. There's always something. It's usually a vague pain. It's usually a headache. And it's because they are trying to make tangible an inner turmoil. So they feel this inner turmoil, but try to give substance to it by then somaticizing. We call it somaticizing, where you manifest as a physical symptom. And I think the whole point of the slide, as wordy as it is depression is a very specific diagnosis. Someone may have the feeling of being sad or depressed, but the diagnosis then of this is clinical depression or major depressive disorder is based on not only that mood element, but additionally, you're going to see impairment in their functioning, you're going to see other symptoms as well. And you'll see there's even a time period linked to it. Very important is to distinguish it from grief. So I'm not going to go through the slide. I think just to speak to it is that depression also comes in many varying forms. As I said, mental health in its entirety is a very complex and convoluted space. And so depression in and of itself, you'll find that there's these differing subtypes. I think perhaps of note for the group today is the the prenatal and postpartum depression. And this basically speaks to the depression that happens during pregnancy, and postpartum is often depression that develops within 4 weeks, within 4 to 6 weeks of delivering a baby. There's other ones, I think, just for your own reading that you can look at, but often you'll find that you have clinical depression or major depressive disorder, or you can basically have depression that is linked to an underlying illness or linked to an underlying medical condition, and then you have all the other various subtypes. Now, treating depression. Now, the cornerstone of treatment with any mental illness, with any mental health condition, my apologies, is psychotherapy. Apologies there, I've put CBT. That's cognitive behavioral therapy, the cornerstone ultimately of most, if not all, mental health conditions is psychotherapy. And for some, it'll be very brief. For others, it'll be prolonged, so much so that even after treatment, people will opt to continue with the therapy. And I think that's often linked just to, I think, the ability of therapy to empower one to reflect is something that a lot of people appreciate even after diagnosis. So psychotherapy, and then the second pillar of treatment is medication. Antidepressants have become, I think, all the more strong and all the more refined over the years. Inevitably, I think the downside of anything that has to do with chemicals in the brain is, the medication is in itself a chemical. And so there's quite a lot of, often you'll find that antidepressants in themselves have a lot of side effects that affect mood or can cause blunting, but that is a story for another day. So medication is the second pillar of treatment. And then there's something called brain stimulation therapy, which we won't go in depth with. I think not particularly relevant for tonight, but this is a mechanism often applied for those with very severe depression or very pronounced psychosis. And it's something that is actually offered in the country. And of course, as a basis for any health condition, lifestyle interventions are always key. Something as simple as eating properly, getting enough sleep, and the regular exercise. And lastly, very importantly, is the social support that is required when one treats any mental health condition. And so the next group of illnesses I want us to quickly talk about is the anxiety disorders, or rather the anxious mind. So anxiety, if you look at the bare basics of its definition, is basically just characterized by two things: excessive fear and worry. Excessive fear and worry. And inevitably, because it's a mental health condition, this excessive fear and worry leads to impairment in daily functioning. So there's significant distress, which leads to impairment in daily function. Now, there's a whole lot of anxiety disorders, a whole lot. And I think one that is coming to the fore now is your panic disorders. Usually characterized by what people would call panic attacks. But there's also other types, like your separation anxiety, you have social anxiety disorder. But I think for the purposes of this engagement, let's just talk a bit about generalized anxiety disorder, which is the most common and the broadest. So generalized anxiety is much more than, the anxiety of I'm going in for an interview, or I am going to play a match. It's not a passing anxiety. It basically is constituted or characterized rather by one, chronic and exaggerated worry and tension. I think in the previous slide we said similarly worry and fear. So it's very importantly, I think, just to remember, it's often chronic, so it's long lasting. It's not just the passing, I was nervous for my interview. And then secondly, it's often exaggerated. So it's out of keeping of surroundings. And so you find that people with anxiety often always expect the worst. So they anticipate disaster. They worry, constantly fixate about what could go wrong. And so you will ask, what is the difference between someone with, generalized anxiety disorder and someone who's a cynic? Because, someone who's negative always expects the worst. You call it a cynic. With anxiety, in fact, with any mental health condition, it's always important to note that the symptoms will always lead, or the thought pattern or symptom will always cause impairment in functioning. And so you'll find that over and above this fear and worry, it starts manifesting into physical symptoms. So often you'll find that people with generalized anxiety, over and above the fear and the worry, this is then accompanied by physical symptoms. So there'll be trembling, there'll be headaches, there'll be twitching, there'll be irritability, there'll be sweating. Some will even tell you, they feel lighthearted. Some will tell you their heart is pounding out of their chest, or they're out of breath. Again, to emphasize, it's usually chronic, so there's a timeline or time factor associated with it, and it's often exaggerated. So the stimulus doesn't justify the response. So it's not like a gunman chasing you down the road. Often you'll find it's a very small stimulus that doesn't justify the response. And similar to, people with depression, sorry, just to touch on that, people with anxiety will also tend to struggle in the workplace or tend to struggle at school because their cognitive and executive function is also impaired. So just very quickly, this mirrors the previous slide, but just speaking to the slide is just to point out again the expanse of symptoms that someone with generalized anxiety has. I think the point maybe just to make outside of the previous slide is that often people with anxiety have what we call rumination. So rumination is when it's almost like the negative of meditation. It's fixating on a negative thing. So they overthink their plans. They overthink and try to, figure solutions to all possible worst case scenarios or outcomes. And again, the physical symptoms over and above just being the trembling and the sweating can, extend to your gastrointestinal tract. So they may also have nausea and diarrhea and vomiting, etc., etc. So that's generalized anxiety. In terms of treatment for anxiety, so anxiety differs a little bit to, major depression, in that anxiety more than depression is mostly dependent on psychotherapy. It depends a lot on the person's ability to overcome their pattern of thinking. Whereas depression, if you look at its etiology or cause, often, some way, somehow, there's more link to a chemical imbalance, whereas anxiety is usually just dysregulated thinking or a dysregulated pattern of thinking. And to speak of it biblically, it's a manifestation of the spirit of fear. Whereas with depression, because there's a chemical element and neurotransmitters that's linked to it, you'll find that the medication is directly targeted at the chemicals. So you'll find with anxiety, therapy is the cornerstone of treatment. The medications in themselves are more targeted at calming the person down. And so often you'll find, unfortunately, it's, the medications, because they are calming, are often sedating. So the medications given for anxiety are often very tiring, very sedating, and people do struggle to cope, I think, with the dosages. And so you'll find that in that medication, there's usually a tapering of the medication. And then just, I think, lastly, to touch on personality disorders. So I think when we talk about personality disorders, the first port of call is to distinguish between personality traits and a personality disorder. We all have personality traits, but we don't all have personality disorders. So a personality trait basically represents a pattern of thinking, of reacting, of perceiving, and of relating that is relatively stable over time. Whereas a personality disorder now becomes apparent when these traits become so pronounced or rigid or maladaptive, so they're so rigid, so fixed that they can't adapt to circumstances or situations. And so these end up impairing work and or interpersonal function. The one big thing about personality disorders, or perhaps let me actually just read it as part of the definition before I speak to it. So, for people with personality disorders, the distress is often caused by a consequence of their socially maladaptive behaviors. So what will often happen with someone with a personality disorder, one of the key things with personality disorder is that, the self-awareness and the insight is generally very poor. So usually when they'll present or seeking help, whether in the form of a doctor or seeking counsel at the church, is more because their disorder has resulted in an interpersonal dysfunction of sorts. So they'll often come and say, "Oh, I'm fighting with this person. Oh, I'm fighting with this person." So they won't usually come because there's a reflection on their behavior or an insight into their behavior, but they will come because there's been a complication of their behavior. I hope that makes sense. And so with personality disorders, what you'll often find is they are often pervasive and enduring patterns of thinking, perceiving, reacting that then cause significant distress. If we look at etiology, some have cited genetics, some have cited environment. It's very difficult to tell, but what you should just look out for is this pervasive pattern of behavior which causes interpersonal disruption. Now, when we look at the personality disorders, we usually would divide them into 3 clusters. So you have cluster A, which is your oddly centric cluster. You have cluster B, the dramatic, unpredictable cluster. And you have cluster C, which is your anxious, fearful cluster. And this is just a grouping of the different types of disorders that you can find. So they were able to group them very largely under 3 main groups. Now, if you look at that, there's probably a few names that will pop out to you, or a few types of personality disorders that will pop out to you. So I'm actually just going to look at 3. But as long as you understand that there's 3 main clusters of personality disorders, and, it's not even about knowing which belongs to which cluster. I think if you just broadly understand that there's 3 main clusters. But often I think the good thing about personality disorders is because it's got to do a lot with interpersonal relations, you might find yourself encountering this sort of person either at work, definitely within the church, even at home. And I think it gives, some sort of comfort in understanding their behavior. So, as I've said, cluster A is your odd and eccentric personality disorders. I'm not going to touch on them in the interests of time, but basically under them you've got your paranoid personality disorder, your schizoid personality, your schizotypal, very self-explanatory in terms of your cluster A group. They are very standout people, very odd, very queer or strange. They stand out like a sore thumb. Your cluster B is perhaps your most famous in terms of the types that you find there. So cluster B is your dramatic or erratic cluster of personalities. So under there, you've got your borderline personality disorders, you've got your antisocial personality disorder, you've got your narcissistic personality disorder, and your histrionic personality disorder. I'm going to speak a little bit more on narcissistic and borderline because I believe those are the 2 we see most commonly. And then lastly, cluster C is your anxious or inhibited cluster. Under that, or as part of that group, you've got your dependent personalities, you've got your avoidant personality disorder, and of course, one of our favorites, your obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, I've put this very wordy slide here, very purposefully. So you'll see, according to the DSM, which is a manual, it's almost like the encyclopedia of mental disorders. This is the diagnostic criteria for a personality disorder. And why this becomes very important, just touching on my previous point, is there is also very, let's call it unwanted stigma or inappropriate stigma that is created out of people labeling, out of people diagnosing. I've read that people who are borderline are like this, and this one must have a personality disorder. Or, this one is definitely, I guess similarly with bipolar. We use these very weighty terms so loosely, just based on an incident or a thing. But what I want us to appreciate, especially with personality disorders, is that coming to the diagnosis of a personality disorder requires a very specific set of criteria. And often because people with personality disorders won't have these They're not going to have your pronounced symptoms, internal symptoms, where either they, are struggling to sleep, are struggling to eat, they're sad, or like with the anxious person is very fearful, they're trembling, they're vomiting. The person with personality disorder, often their symptom will affect people and not them so much. And that's why we need to be very aware of how we diagnose this. A very quick word on narcissistic personality types and borderline personality types. The narcissist is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity. They always need applause. They always need to be, adulated. And sometimes there'll be a lack of empathy. And so your narcissistic personality, you'll see, I think, in society, and even in the Bible, this will often be people in positions of power. They relish power, they relish applause. In a day-to-day, it plays out often in our workplaces, but it can actually also play out in our families, because these people often struggle with their self-esteem. And so you'll find that there's this overcompensation of always being applauded, always having to be appreciated, always having to point out what it is they do, what their contribution is, why they are superior or special. And so that's your narcissistic personality disorder. Your borderline personality disorder is characterized, again, by pervasive. When we say pervasive, it means continuous, not just a once-off incident. Pattern of instability and hypersensitivity in interpersonal relationships, instability in their self-image. They have extreme mood fluctuations and impulsivity. One thing about the borderline personality disorder, you will not miss them. If you have one in your family, if you have one in your circle, you will not miss them. The one very maybe quick point about the personality, about the borderline person, is that they have this constant shift. You'll be a favorite in this season. In the next season, you are the worst person ever. So there's this often shift, from someone having such extreme value to being completely valueless. Lastly, a quick word on obsessive compulsive personality disorder. I think I've just included it purely because it is also so common, and just we must distinguish. There's obsessive compulsive personality disorder, and then there's actually an obsessive compulsive disorder in and of itself. But this group basically suffers from preoccupation. So they're preoccupied with how things must always be in control. They must always be in control of themselves, in control of situations. There must always be order. There must always be perfectionism. And as I've consistently said, it only becomes a disorder when it interferes with your daily functioning. I'm not going to go through the treatment of personality disorder. Safe to say, as with the anxiety disorder, it's not so much medication-based. The cornerstone of personality is very much psychotherapy and the exercise of reflecting. So it'll often be individual or group psychotherapy is often very, very effective with the personality disorder. And so I think maybe a last point about the personality disorder is that you may find, so the one thing about personality disorders, very difficult to treat. Very difficult to treat because often it's embedded in the person's existing personality. It almost crossed the border and became abnormal, for lack of a better word. So you'll find that even in trying to correct, it's very difficult because it's so embedded in the person's character. I think maybe let's leave it at that with the personality disorders. I'm very cognizant of time. So maybe just to wrap up, I think let's leave the questions for the end, or questions or comments for the end. But I think just to wrap up, we've spoken about the depressed mind and the depressive disorders. We've spoken about the anxious mind and, the anxiety disorders. We've spoken about personality disorders. I didn't cite the numbers, but the numbers are saying the incidence of mental health illness is as high as 1 in 8, which is 12.5%. And of course, this is data that's coming from North America, coming from Europe. Within the African space, it's still a very stigmatized space. It's still a very unrecognized space in terms of actually identifying and diagnosis. So you may find that it's actually higher than this 1 in 8 people. But what is the bottom line? So what if someone has a personality disorder or has depression? So, just the take home for today, I always like to work in 1, 2, 3s or ABCs. Always simplifies things for me. So A is for awareness. And I say awareness of others and awareness of self. Proverbs 18:15 says, "The heart of the prudent acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge." And so, the cornerstone of all of this is actually being aware, one, of self, and also being aware of others, because it's in that awareness that we are able to empower people, with the requisite sort of referral, whether you empower them with knowledge or referral or with prayer, whatever it is. But I do believe the first step is actually the awareness of, okay, no, this is Nontu's personality disorder now that's speaking. This is now not within, the normal limits. This is now personality disorder. How do I help? And similarly, awareness of self. I think there's a lot of personality traits that we have individually, but also being aware enough to know that this is now not me. I don't sleep until 6 p.m. What is wrong? So A is for awareness. And I think along with that, in as much as we need to be more aware and knowledgeable, we also need to avoid knowledge that puffs up. We must be careful that we do not manipulate the knowledge we have to judge people, to condemn people, to label people, to stigmatize people. Because there's a lot of power also that comes with that knowledge and recognition. I think, the second point, B is for be vigilant, keep watch, and the prayer warriors on the call will know exactly what I mean. At a spiritual level, you need to already map, take note of unhealthy thought patterns, take note of adverse generational history, history of suicides, history of depressions in the family. And unfortunately for us, because our families did not have the luxury of psychiatrists and psychologists, it'll often be very ill-defined. You'll hear about, there was that aunt who was moody, who wouldn't come to family functions. Then the next, would always start fights. Be vigilant and keep watch, and uproot already in the spirit unhealthy thought patterns that are invoked by fear, that are invoked by anxiety, and adverse generational patterns. Similarly, vigilance about what you're taking into your body. And then C, we've done our A, awareness. B, be vigilant. And C is considered action. And I say considered action because it's not just a matter of action. So, the action needs to be considered in seeking medical care. And again, I think I've just a disclaimer, as I have mentioned the avenues available, like psychotherapy, like medication. Ultimately, you're able to, as long as you make an informed decision of how you approach things, and how, whether it's a family member, whether it's yourself, the decision must always be informed. So seek medical care, contend in prayer, consider counseling, dietary modification. And I almost have let's just remind myself, I think it was in Nehemiah, the rebuilding. It's almost like you build and you fight. It's the building on the one side with the sword on the other hand. You wage war. You wage war in whichever way. And you can wage war in a multifaceted way. You must contend in the spirit. You must contend in prayer. But physically, if it's reached a certain point, seek psychotherapy, consider medication, make the necessary dietary modifications or lifestyle modifications that you need to get through mental health disorders or conditions. And just my last word, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 4-5 reads, "The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." So what is the point? Our thoughts become our actions, which inevitably become our behaviors and habits. And so the mind, which is not aligned to Christ, ultimately has the potential to sabotage purpose. And that's why Apostle Paul says, take captive. And remember, taking captive it's an active thing. It's not a casual thing. You take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Thank you so much. I will hand over to Pastor Tseho.